Nas vs Friga looks to be the most anticipated matchup of the modern YouTube 1v1 basketball community, and as it approaches less than 2 days out, I want to share my analysis of the matchup. So a core element which makes this matchup so intriguing is that Friga is a high variance player, meaning that Friga is inconsistent and can easily perform far above his average level of play, or far below his average level of play. This variance is largely a product of Friga's playstyle since he lives and dies by his shot making from 3. However, in his matchup against Nas, Friga's variance is his X factor. He's the underdog against Nas because his average game is worse than Nas's average game. I judge Friga's average game to be around the same level as Moon's, and as great as Moon is, I wouldn't like his odds versus Nas. So I got Friga on average about as good as Moon, a player who I think Nas would reliably beat. But because of Friga's variance, he has a real shot against Nas since his good games are so good. Moreover, Friga is always a threat to have a good game or turn a bad game around since he can heat up with just a few makes. Conversely, Friga in his bad games can perform much worse, and he suffered some really rough losses as a consequence, like that fluke versus Cash Nasty. Friga's extreme variance makes him a player who is always a threat to pull off an upset, but also be upset. In any case, the point here is this. Nas has a higher baseline and floor than Friga, but Friga has a higher ceiling. Thus, the most reliable win condition for Friga is one in which he finds a spark that ignites his incendiary flow state. As for Nas, he puts himself in very good position to win by smothering Friga's breathing room and denying him the oxygen to ignite a flame. Of course, it's at least metaphysically possible for Friga to win without tapping into his nuclear shot making, if Nas has a really poor offensive performance. But it wouldn't be wise for Friga to rely on this path to victory, because if Friga is the face of variance, Nas is the embodiment of consistency, and it partly consists in his versatility. Nas can hit shots at all 3 levels, and has the bag and strength to carve to his spots within those 3 levels. So if he struggles in one area offensively, his versatility grants so many other options to fall back on, which raises the floor of his game. Friga, on the other hand, can also hit shots from all 3 levels, but he doesn't choose to shoot as diversely as Nas. When Friga's 3s aren't falling, he's more willing to keep hunting 3s until he shoots himself into rhythm. With regard to Friga's versatility in getting to spots, Friga doesn't have as deep a bag to flow and counter into different spots like Nas, nor does he have the same strength to power to spots like Nas. Moreover, it isn't just a difference in quantity of offensive options that underlies Nas's consistency and Friga's variance. It's also the priority of offensive options. Nas's primary offensive option is his devastating downhill drive, which generates shots at the rim, whereas Friga's primary offensive option is his 3-point shot making. Shots at the rim are generally quite makeable, even during a rough shooting stretch, and in this way they are more consistent than 3s. However, 3s are obviously worth more, and in this way they offer more explosive scoring. Another way of framing these outline differences between 3s and layups is that layups are more consistent while 3s have higher variance. Hopefully that rings a bell. Put plainly, this point regarding priority is that because Nas takes more consistent shots, he is more easily consistent, and since Friga takes higher variance shots, he is more easily high variance. Overall, Nas's offense is too good for Friga to shut down, and consistent enough that Friga cannot rely on the hope that Nas just has a horrid offensive game. One way or another, Nas will get points on the board versus Friga, which is why I view Friga's probable win condition to be one where he catches fire and outshoots Nas. So far, I presented the reliable win conditions for Friga and Nas as a matter of whether Friga manages to break the game open with nuclear shot making. And then I argued that anything less from Friga will not reliably beat Nas. The concern now is how likely each player's respective win condition is, namely, the likelihood that Friga finds a spark to ignite his incendiary flow state versus the likelihood Nas smothers Friga's breathing room and denies him the oxygen to ignite. To assess these competing probabilities, I analyzed Nas's defense versus Friga's offense, and then how the particular context of this matchup helps or hurts each player. Starting with Friga's offense, one advantage he has is his strong first step, which Nas has struggled with in the past. This puts Nas in a very demanding defensive situation because Nas has to apply consistent pressure to Friga, as Friga can heat up at any moment. However, Nas has to manage this without getting blitzed by Friga's first step. As such, I expect Nas to guard with very high pressure on Friga, and a top foot on Friga's right side, similar to how Nas guarded Scoob in the Nesquik Creator Core 1v1 or how Moon guarded Friga in the next chapter Season 10 rematch. This defensive strategy deprives Friga of the room to shoot the jab 3 or cleanly get to his triple threat rip through to the right, and if Friga does go right, it forces him into a wide angle where Nas can cut him off and force a preferable mid-range shot. If Friga instead opts to attack better downhill angles going left, he either has to finish through Nas's size and strength with his weak hand or find a mid-range shot. Of course, Friga can opt to create separation laterally instead of downhill, and this is actually where his escape moves shine, such as his signature sidestep and his snatchback and stepback. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the micro-level X's and O's of this matchup, but if you're interested in that, Marcellus Howard just dropped a video on the matchup, and Devin the Lab has ranking videos for Friga and Nas respectively. All those videos do great to further explore the mechanical aspects of Nas and Friga's game, and links are in the description. With regard to the aggressive defensive strategy I expect Nas to try, there may be a concern of how it is so exhausting to sustain. As Devin the Lab pointed out in his ranking video on Nas, aggressive defense requires the defender to react, pay attention to, and move with the offensive player much more, which expends so much energy. However, something I've learned about Nas is that he has excellent endurance, and it was on full display in his 1v1 with Luis. It was a very defensive game down the stretch, and well before the game ended, it reached a point where I'd expect players to start giving up some free shots on defense. Instead, Nas persevered, dug in, and sustained his defensive aggression to grind out victory in a game that lasted an absurd 88 minutes. All in all, there are viable defensive strategies Nas has to suppress Friga's flame, but they don't cover every option, and still leave Friga ways to viably catch fire if he hits tough but makeable shots for him. If I were to end the analysis here, I would give Friga a 25% chance of beating Nas, but to end the analysis here would be to ignore unique and impactful psychological and contextual considerations of the Nas and Friga matchup. For one, Friga seems to excel when the pressure is off of him. The biggest wins under his belt are the rematch versus Nas, his win against BJ, his win against Isote, and his first game against Moon. In each of those games, Friga was at least very arguably the underdog, and when he's the underdog, he's able to play without the pressure of winning expectations. Now, the assertion that Friga was the underdog in all those matchups may sound like a very hot take today, because it is easy to forget how much worse people viewed Friga as a 1v1 player in the past. A little over a year ago, Friga was viewed to be around Hoodie Kel's level, and he looked as much in his game against Kel, which ended prematurely with Kel up 18-17. It wasn't until Friga beat BJ, and then a few months later Tay and Moon, that he seemed to surge through the rankings and enter a lot of top 5 discussions. So Friga's status as the favorite or underdog in the mentioned big wins should be evaluated within the context of when they occurred. In Friga's Nas rematch, Friga was obviously the underdog because one of Nas's first YouTube showings was a 1v1 where he beat Friga bad. In Friga's game against BJ, Friga himself asserts to uncontroversially be the underdog.
Obviously I'm the underdog in this 1v1.
When Friga entered his game versus Tay, his recent performances at that point were uninspiring. Excluding games against players who were plainly not on his level, Friga's last couple 1v1s were a loss to Simba and his game versus Kel, which again ended prematurely with Kel up 1. Meanwhile, Tay was still commonly viewed as the best next chapter player behind Rob. Against Moon, Friga was coming off a huge win versus Tay, but it was just one win. Friga had taken a big win before in his Nas rematch, but failed to follow it with sustained dominance as he lost to Fambi a few months later. So when Friga beat Tay, it wasn't clear whether he really reached another level or if it was just one of his hot shooting upsets. Plus, besides the win against Tay, Friga's last 2 high-level 1v1s at that point were still the loss to Simba and the Kel game, and Moon had already beaten Kel twice at this point. Friga has also shown to put together a lot of his best stretches in comeback situations where the pressure is off of him and is instead on his opponent, who has to close out a game that's theirs to lose. One example is Friga's win in the Nas rematch, where 3 minutes into the game, he still only had 1 point and trailed Nas 8-1. From that point, Friga then proceeded to get hot, bombard the gym with contested missiles, and rally a 15-4 comeback in the following 5.5 minutes. In his game against Tay, Friga found himself on the brink of defeat, down 29-20 in a game of 30. The game seemed over until Friga got possession and rattled off 4 straight threes to torch Tay in a triumphant turn of the tide. In his game against Moon, Friga had to dig himself out of a 16-0 deficit in a game of 30. He eroded the deficit defensively by disrupting Moon and offensively by taking what Moon gave him, all the way until Friga was only down 21-18. Then, Friga went thermonuclear and hit 4 threes in his next 4 field goal attempts, including this absolute stunner at the buzzer. This view that Friga excels when there's less pressure is also supported by evidence that he struggles when there's more pressure. Recall how I described Friga as a threat to pull off an upset, but when he has the pressure of winning expectations on him, he is also liable to lose in an upset. A striking example is his loss as the heavy favorite versus Cash Nasty. Also, the loss against DC Heat very early in Friga's YouTube career. Then there's the loss against MK, where Friga came out nonchalant and suffered a rough defeat in a matchup where he was at least slightly favored. After that, it was expected that if Friga got the opportunity to rematch MK, he would redeem himself in a strong performance. But when Friga did get his chance to rematch MK, he lost again. Furthermore, when Friga has a large lead and the pressure is on him to close out a game that's his to lose, he can blow it, which adds to the evidence that he can struggle when the pressure is on him. In Friga's loss to Simba, his largest lead was 20-9 in a game of 30, and he was 2 of 3 from 3 up to that point. Then, he went on to shoot 2 of 6 from 3, miss a crucial free throw, and give up a 21-6 run to lose. In Friga's loss to DC Heat, his largest lead was 7-3, and he shot 2 of 3 from 3 to help score those 7 points in just the first 3.5 minutes of the game. Then, he went on to shoot 0 of 6 from 3 and score just 5 points in the next 9 minutes to give up a 13-5 run and lose. In Friga's second loss to MK, the format was best of 3, games to 11. Friga went up 10-4 in the first game, but then gave up a 7-0 run to drop the first game, and he proceeded to lose the second. In Friga's win against Burke, he almost blew a huge lead. Friga went up 16-3 in a game to 30, and he shot 3 of 3 from 3 up to that point. Then he went on to shoot just 3 of 7 from 3 and give up a 24-14 run, although Friga managed to close out and win 30-27. It should be noted that besides the Simba game, all of the Friga losses I covered happened at least 2 years ago, and I believe Friga has evolved into a player with more poise and a better handle of pressure. Regardless, Friga's victories against Nas, Moon, BJ, and Tay support the relevant takeaway that when the pressure is off of him, Friga excels and is better able to tap into his nuclear shot making. Another contextual factor which helps relieve Friga of pressure and unleash his shot making is the stakes of the Nas matchup, which are lower for Friga since he has less to lose and more to gain. If Friga loses to Nas in a deficit of 30-20 or better, Friga's ranking in the 1v1 community may barely change, if at all. Conversely, if Friga beats Nas, he pulls off an upset that reverberates throughout the community and is likely crowned the best 1v1 player. Thus, Friga enjoys a very favorable risk to reward versus Nas, and together with his underdog status, the context of the Nas matchup lifts a lot of pressure off Friga. As for Nas, he very much has more to lose and less to gain. A loss to Friga sweeps the throne out from under him, and while it isn't enough to knock him out of the top 5, there seems to be a notion in the 1v1 community that it would be very difficult for him to redeem a loss to Friga.
I will say this though, if Friga wins, that's gonna be the biggest amount of humble pie for Nas.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't know what he can do after that.
If he loses,
there's no amount of 1v1s he could do in 2025 that's gonna make up for that.
This may be because Nas is a player who has always risen to the occasion and produced diamonds under pressure. And since this Friga matchup calls Nas to his tallest occasion yet, maybe people think a loss here would reveal a height which Nas can't rise to. Friga has actually been playing this angle that the pressure is all on Nas too. In his video, The End of Nasir Core, Friga stresses that Nas has to win their game.
It's not just that he wants to win, he needs to. A loss right now would send him into a spiral.
Personally, I don't think Nas would fall quite that far from grace if he lost to Friga, especially if it's like 30 to 27 and Friga just hits ridiculous shots. However, Nas definitely bears the pressure in that Friga matchup, although I think Nas will handle it just fine. Mechanically, Nas's game is built to be consistent, as explained earlier. Psychologically, he's very self-assured and maybe the most battle-tested in the community. Plus, he already plays all his 1v1s with very high stakes, since players always want a shot to challenge Nas as the best. Now if Nas beats Friga, it doesn't seem to change much for him. He's already the most common pick for number 1 in the community, and while a win versus Friga separates him more from guys like Rob and Zay, it doesn't shake the rankings up. All in all, Friga's underdog status and favorable stakes ease the pressure off him in the Nas matchup, and with less pressure, Friga is better able to realize his win condition of breaking the game open with shot making. Thus, I deem the psycho-contextual details of Friga's underdog status and favorable stakes to improve his odds to beat Nas from 25% to 35%. To close, I described some fun and plausible scenarios for how Nas vs Friga may play out in a Friga win and a Nas win, and both scenarios play out the same until halftime. Out the gate, Nas and Friga play controlled and methodically as they get a feel for each other and settle into the gravity of the moment. There may be a lid on the rim for the first few possessions, but eventually someone draws first blood, and if I have to bet, it's Nas. As they're settling in, Nas uses his offensive versatility and overwhelming power to gradually put points on the board, and his disruptive defense keeps Friga from heating up with the looks he likes. Still, Friga finds enough points to stay in the game, probably with a few driving angles and fouls against Nas's aggression. However, Nas's steady offense and defensive pressure build a decent lead, and he enters halftime up 15-9. Now, this is the crucial point that diverges into either a win for Friga or a win for Nas. In a Friga win, he uses halftime to collect himself and analyze. He and Nas come back out, and early into the second half, Friga gets a big 3 to drop, maybe by attacking with a halftime adjustment. Soon after, another 3 drops and further closes the lead. It's getting scary now. Nas tries to adjust defensively, but now Friga just needs the slightest angle, and once he gets Nas to open up and have to recover, he uses his escape moves to get behind the line and rain 3s over the contest. Nas fights back offensively, but Friga's burst scoring catches him and pulls out the win. Final score 30-26. Now in a Nas win, Friga comes out of halftime without a working adjustment. Nas's lead continues to slowly inflate, and Friga starts forcing really tough 3s without rhythm, which don't drop. Friga isn't able to string together a good run to keep Nas on defense, and guarding Nas's brute force starts to wear him out. Nas continues to sustain the lead and eventually secures a controlled victory by doing his work early and not letting up. Final score 30-22. Hey everyone, thank you so much for checking out my first video. I know it's very short notice ahead of the Nas and Friga matchup, and I hope to upload it sooner, but I severely underestimated the production workload. The video probably took me around 50 hours total, so if you found it interesting, I encourage you to help water the seed that is Hoopology with a like and subscribe. I definitely plan to keep producing content in this YouTube 1v1 niche, so if you have any interesting YouTube 1v1 video ideas, please share in the comments.